Right, so good evening. Today we're going to talk about in our notes Charles Darwin, who was kind of the discovery and talking about this aspect of things changing and this whole theory of evolution. And so on the top of your notes on page 3 in your packet, please put I can describe the discoveries of Charles Darwin. All right, so we're going to just kind of start diving into who he was. He was born in England in 1809. He was an English scientist and naturalist. He grew up in a time where things were shifting in the science world, and he was trying to do all these different discoveries of looking at nature and looking at how things are patterns of inheritance and traits and all these kinds of different aspects. So he developed over time his theory of evolution. And so his theory explains that modern organisms evolved over a long time through something called descent from common ancestors. So he's talking about how organisms have changed over time, but they have changed compared to or relative to their ancestors. And so he made his discoveries on his adventures. And so Charles Darwin sailed across the world, essentially, on a Beagle ship for 5 years on his voyage. And he, if you look at this map over, this is where he stopped throughout his travels and where he collected different specimens and of plants and animals and kind of saw these different kind of comparisons as he traveled. So we're going to talk about those that you notice. He had 3 patterns of biological diversity, of how things are different yet similar throughout his travels and throughout the world. And so these are the 3 that we're going to focus on: species vary globally, species vary locally, and species vary over time. So we're going to talk about species varying globally. And so something he noticed was the flightless ground-dwelling birds and what he noticed about the differences and similarities of them in each country. So the reyes looked like this in South America, the ostriches in Africa, and the emus in Australia. So again, he noticed that what they had in common were they were flightless ground-dwelling birds, and that he noticed, though, that there are some differences with the size, their feathers, the long of their neck, what they ate, those kinds of different things. So he saw those differences and noticed they must have come from some common ancestry because they live in different environments, which means they feed on different things. They act and behave in different ways, but they have very similar characteristics. Then he looked at how species varied locally. So his famous place that we're going to talk about a lot in this unit is the Galapagos Islands. So if you look at this map over here, this is North America, South America, and Galapagos Islands is right there, and there's a couple of islands in the Galapagos. And so he went there for a while and looked at the giant land tortoises, and he observed their shells, he observed their neck, he observed what they ate. And so when he looked there between the Isabella Island and the Hood Island, so Hood and Isabella, he looked at the difference of the giant land tortoise and their shells, their shell covering and their neck. And so the high peaks and rainy and abundant vegetation would have seen a tortoise with a dome-shaped neck and a short neck because there's a lot of vegetation on the ground that the turtle could get. But in the Hood Island, it was flat and it was dry, and the vegetation was off the ground. So he noticed that the tortoises had this dome curved open part of the shell so the neck could be long so it can reach up high to that vegetation above. And so he noticed also these finches at the Galapagos Islands. And he saw differences in finches in South America by the Galapagos from compared those finches from South America and to the Galapagos Islands, and he studied their different beaks. He studied the different types of food he had, and he noticed that there are some differences in the beaks from those 2 places. So he wanted to know, how did that happen? So he thought maybe there was something called divergence, where a species gains enough difference, they become separate species over time. There's something called isolation, where for some reason the birds on the Galapagos become completely isolated from the South America finches, and so eventually they cannot even mate or produce fertile offspring anymore. And then there's something called adaptive radiation, which is a process where a single group of species evolves into a different form and they live in different ways. And so if you look at this picture here of adaptive radiation, there's this some common, these are all the different finches, okay, all these different finches and where they located and the different species, and you can tell they have different beak sizes, but it's just showing that they eat different things, but there must have been some commonality, some common ancestral line, and they descended off of that. And then looking at species vary over time. So Darwin found fossils, and he collected and preserved those fossils when he was on his journey and his trip. And so he noticed that some fossils, they were very similar to extinct animals versus the ones currently alive. And so the one we're going to talk about is the glyptodont. He found a glyptodont fossil, and it looks very, very similar to what we know as the armadillo today. Obviously, in size, the glyptodont is much more massive, and the glyptodont was in the Science Museum, actually in Minnesota, and so we have that to see. But the glyptodont has this massive shell just like the Amarillo did. And he saw these patterns and he saw these differences, and he just kept questioning, why is the glyptodont not here anymore? How is this compared to the armadillo? Did the armadillo come from the glyptodont? So he had all these kinds of questions that led to this kind of theory and discovery. So one last thing is what Charles Darwin did when he was at home, when he was on his homestead. He did something called artificial selection, which is the same thing as selective breeding, which we talked about in the last unit. Darwin studied different plants and animals, and he did different breeding techniques to see if variations would change in populations from parent to offspring. And his most famous artificial selection process or selective breeding was the pigeons. He really liked to test them and breed them and come up with different varieties of pigeons. And so here are some very unique different types of pigeons that he tried to artificially select or selectively bred to get some different variations. And there were natural variations, and he just chose to see if he could bring those out in certain pigeon offspring. And so that is the notes, and we will continue talking about evolution when you return.